before the world was divided by doctrine, before the councils, the creeds, and the careful rewriting of history. There were other voices, voices that whispered of a woman whose name was once spoken alongside Jesus, a woman honored, then erased. Tonight we reopen a door that was forced shut, a door sealed by politics, power, and fear. In the deserts of Egypt, a fragment was found, 4 faded lines that, if real, would rewrite 2,000 years of belief. Lines that speak of a companion, a disciple, and perhaps something more. Why would a single woman be such a threat? Why would entire manuscripts vanish? And what story were we never meant to read? This is the lost gospel they hid, and once you hear it, you'll understand why. What if everything you thought you knew about Jesus was deliberately hidden from you? What if the most powerful religious institutions in history conspired to erase evidence of his most intimate relationship? What if there was a gospel older than the ones in your Bible that reveals Jesus had a wife whose teachings were considered so dangerous they had to be buried forever? In the scorching deserts of Egypt, beneath centuries of sand and silence, archaeologists have uncovered manuscripts that challenge the very foundation of Christianity as we know it. These aren't modern fabrications or conspiracy theories. These are ancient documents, written in the same era as the canonical Gospels, containing testimonies from people who claim to walk alongside Jesus himself. And what they reveal about his relationship with a woman named Mary Magdalene will shake you to your core. So, the woman they tried to erase wasn't just a follower. According to these hidden texts, she was Jesus' closest companion, his spiritual equal, and possibly his wife. But here's what makes this discovery absolutely explosive. The early church didn't just ignore her story. They actively rewrote it, transforming one of Christianity's most powerful female leaders into a repentant prostitute whose only significance was being saved by male authority. This isn't speculation. This is documented historical revisionism that spans nearly 2,000 years. The evidence has been sitting in libraries and museums waiting for scholars brave enough to piece together what was deliberately torn apart. Today we're going to examine that evidence. We're going to explore why these texts were buried. And we're going to discover what they reveal about the real relationship between Jesus and the woman who may have understood his message better than anyone else. By the end of this investigation, you'll understand why the Vatican has spent centuries ensuring most Christians never hear this story. You'll see how theological politics shaped the Bible you read today. And you'll discover why recovering this lost narrative might be the key to understanding what Jesus actually taught about love, partnership, and the divine feminine. The story begins not in Jerusalem or Rome, but in the Egyptian village of Nag Hammadi in 1945. A farmer digging for fertilizer struck something that would forever change our understanding of early Christianity. What emerged from that ancient burial site was a collection of 13 leather-bound books containing 52 texts that had been hidden for over 16 centuries. These weren't random religious writings. They were the sacred scriptures of Christian communities that had been systematically eliminated from history. Among these buried treasures was a document that would send shock waves through the academic world. The Gospel of Philip contained passages that portrayed Mary Magdalene not as a distant follower, but as Jesus' intimate companion. The text describes Jesus kissing Mary often and refers to her using terms that ancient readers would have understood as indicating a romantic partnership. Even more shocking, the Gospel presents Mary as receiving private teachings from Jesus that the male disciples couldn't understand or access. But the Gospel of Philip wasn't alone. Another text discovered in that Egyptian desert, the Gospel of Mary, goes even further in depicting Mary Magdalene's central role in early Christianity. In this Gospel, Mary receives visions and revelations directly from Jesus after his death, when she shares these teachings with the other disciples. Peter becomes angry and challenges her authority, asking why Jesus would reveal secrets to a woman that he hadn't shared with the men. The text presents this as Peter's fundamental misunderstanding of spiritual authority and divine revelation. These weren't isolated documents written by fringe groups. Multiple independent sources from the early Christian period consistently portray Mary Magdalene as holding a position of authority and intimacy with Jesus that the canonical Gospels systematically minimize or ignore. The pattern is too consistent and too widespread to be coincidental. Something happened in the early centuries of Christianity that transformed Mary Magdalene from teacher and leader into a marginalized figure whose true role was erased from official church history. The process of erasure wasn't accidental. It was systematic, deliberate, and remarkably successful. By the 4th century, when Christianity became the official religion of the Roman Empire, church authorities had already begun the process of standardizing Christian belief and practice. This standardization required eliminating alternative versions of Christianity that emphasized different aspects of Jesus' teaching or presented different models of spiritual authority. The communities that treasured the Gospel of Philip and the Gospel of Mary represented forms of Christianity that were fundamentally different from what would become Orthodox tradition. These communities often practiced radical equality between men and women, with women serving as teachers, prophets, and leaders in ways that the emerging institutional church found threatening. Their Gospels didn't just include women as characters in the story. They presented women as recipients of divine revelation and holders of spiritual authority equal to or sometimes greater than their male counterparts. This egalitarian approach to spiritual leadership posed an existential threat to the male-dominated church hierarchy that was consolidating power in the 3rd and 4th centuries. If women could receive direct revelation from Jesus, if they could teach and lead communities, if they could possess spiritual authority based on wisdom rather than institutional position, then what need was there for the elaborate ecclesiastical structures that church leaders were building? The solution was elegant in its simplicity. Rather than engaging with these alternative traditions or attempting to refute their claims, church authorities simply declared them heretical and systematically destroyed their texts. Communities that refused to conform were persecuted. Their books were burned. Their leaders were exiled or killed. Within a few centuries, these alternative versions of Christianity had been so thoroughly suppressed that most people forgot they had ever existed. But the erasure went beyond simply eliminating competing texts. Church authorities actively rewrote the story of Mary Magdalene herself, transforming her from teacher and leader into a very different kind of figure. By the 6th century, Pope Gregory the Great had officially declared Mary Magdalene to be a reformed prostitute whose main significance lay in demonstrating the Church's power to redeem fallen women. This wasn't based on any biblical evidence. Nowhere in the canonical Gospels is Mary Magdalene described as a prostitute. It was a deliberate fabrication designed to eliminate any memory of her role as a spiritual authority. The transformation was remarkably effective. For over 14 centuries, Western Christianity accepted the image of Mary Magdalene as a repentant sinner whose primary function was to show male religious authorities' capacity for forgiveness. The idea that she might have been Jesus's wife, his closest disciple, or a teacher in her own right became literally unthinkable within Orthodox Christian consciousness. The rediscovery of the Nag Hammadi texts in 1945 began to unravel this carefully constructed narrative. For the first time in over 15 centuries, scholars could read what these ancient Christian communities had actually believed about Mary Magdalene rather than relying on the distorted accounts provided by their enemies. What they found challenged not just individual details about early Christian history, but fundamental assumptions about how Christianity developed and why certain voices were silenced. The Gospel of Philip contains the most explicit references to the intimate relationship between Jesus and Mary Magdalene. The text describes Jesus as loving Mary more than all the disciples and kissing her often on her mouth. It refers to Mary as Jesus's companion, using a Greek term that could be translated as partner, consort, or spouse. While some portions of the manuscript are damaged, making complete sentences difficult to reconstruct, the overall impression is unmistakable. This text presents Jesus and Mary as having a romantic and possibly sexual relationship. Even more significant than the romantic elements is the spiritual authority that the Gospel of Philip attributes to Mary Magdalene. She isn't portrayed simply as Jesus' wife or lover, but as his spiritual equal and the recipient of teachings that other disciples couldn't access. The text suggests that Mary's intimate relationship with Jesus gave her unique insights into his message that made her a more advanced teacher than the male apostles. This portrayal of Mary as both intimate partner and spiritual authority represents a radically different model of religious leadership than what developed in Orthodox Christianity. Instead of celibate male priests mediating between believers and God, the Gospel of Philip presents the possibility of spiritual authority emerging from intimate partnership and shared revelation. The divine wasn't accessed through hierarchical institutions, but through the kind of deep personal connection that Jesus and Mary exemplified. The Gospel of Mary develops these themes even further by showing Mary in action as a teacher and revealer of divine truth. After Jesus' death, Mary comforts the grieving disciples and shares visions that Jesus had given her privately. Her teachings are sophisticated and mystical, dealing with the nature of sin, the structure of reality, and the path to spiritual liberation. This isn't a woman being taught by men. This is a woman teaching men things they couldn't understand on their own. The male disciples' reaction to Mary's teaching reveals the gender dynamics that would eventually lead to her erasure from Christian history. Peter becomes angry and challenges Mary's authority, asking whether they should really listen to a woman and whether Jesus would have shared secrets with her that he hadn't revealed to them. Other disciples defend Mary, pointing out that Jesus clearly loved her more than he loved them and that they should listen to her teachings rather than rejecting them because of her gender. This conflict between Mary and Peter wasn't just about individual personalities. It represented competing visions of how early Christian communities should be organized and who should hold authority within them. Peter represented the emerging institutional model that would eventually dominate Christianity, with authority flowing through apostolic succession and male hierarchical structures. Mary represented an alternative model based on direct spiritual experience and personal revelation that didn't depend on gender or institutional position. The canonical Gospels contain hints of this same conflict, though they're much more subtle about it. In the Gospel of John, Mary Magdalene is the first witness to Jesus' resurrection. But when she tells the male disciples what she has seen, they don't believe her. In Luke's account, the women who report the empty tomb are dismissed by the apostles as speaking nonsense. These brief mentions suggest tensions that the alternative Gospels explore much more explicitly. The systematic suppression of these alternative traditions represents one of the most successful campaigns of historical revisionism in human history. By the 5th century, the diverse, experimental, often egalitarian Christianity of the first few centuries had been replaced by a unified, hierarchical institution that brooked no challenge to its authority. The texts that preserved different voices and different stories were not just ignored. They were actively hunted down and destroyed. The communities that had treasured the Gospel of Philip and the Gospel of Mary faced a choice. They could convert to Orthodox Christianity and abandon their traditional texts and practices, or they could face persecution, exile, and death. Most chose survival, but some chose preservation. The 13 books buried at Nag Hammadi represent the desperate act of a community that knew its traditions were about to be eliminated forever. They sealed their sacred texts in jars and buried them in the desert, hoping that someday the truth they contained would be rediscovered. That someday came in 1945. But the implications of the discovery are still being processed. The texts reveal that early Christianity was far more diverse than most people realize. They show that women played central roles in early Christian communities that were later written out of official history. Most significantly for our investigation, they provide evidence that Jesus' relationship with Mary Magdalene was far more intimate and significant than the canonical Gospels suggest. The question that emerges from this evidence isn't whether these alternative Gospels are historically accurate in every detail. Ancient texts are complex documents that require careful interpretation. The question is why these particular stories about Jesus and Mary were considered so dangerous that they had to be completely eliminated from Christian consciousness. What was it about the idea of Jesus having a wife, about women holding spiritual authority, about intimate partnership as a path to divine revelation that threatened the emerging church so profoundly? The answer lies in understanding what was really at stake in those crucial early centuries of Christianity. This wasn't just a theological debate about ancient texts. It was a battle for control over the most influential religious movement in human history, and the winners got to write the official story. When Constantine legalized Christianity in the 4th century, he wasn't just granting religious freedom. He was making a calculated political decision that would transform both the Roman Empire and Christianity itself. But Constantine and his advisors faced a problem. Christianity wasn't a unified movement. It was a collection of diverse communities with radically different beliefs about Jesus, salvation, and spiritual authority. Some Christian groups believed Jesus was fully divine but not really human. Others taught that he was human but not divine. Some communities baptized the dead. Others rejected marriage entirely. Some groups were led by women prophets who claimed direct revelation from Christ. Others insisted that only male bishops could interpret divine truth. The diversity was staggering, and for imperial purposes it was unmanageable. Constantine needed a version of Christianity that could serve as a unifying force for his empire. He needed clear doctrines, standardized practices, and hierarchical authority structures that could be integrated with Roman administrative systems. The experimental, mystical, egalitarian forms of Christianity represented by texts like the Gospel of Philip and the Gospel of Mary were exactly what he couldn't use. The Council of Nicaea in 325 CE marked the beginning of the end for alternative Christian traditions. While the council is famous for establishing the doctrine of the Trinity, its more significant achievement was creating the mechanism by which Orthodox belief could be defined and enforced. Bishops who attended the council weren't just debating theological abstractions. They were deciding which version of Christianity would receive imperial support and which would be declared illegal. The political implications were enormous. Christian communities that aligned with imperial orthodoxy gained access to resources, protection, and influence. Communities that refused to conform faced persecution, exile, and destruction. The choice wasn't really theological, it was about survival. This imperial support came with strings attached. The Christianity that emerged from the 4th century was designed to be compatible with Roman power structures. It emphasized obedience to authority, acceptance of hierarchy, and the importance of maintaining social order. The radical egalitarianism that characterized many early Christian communities was systematically eliminated as incompatible with imperial governance. Women's leadership became an early casualty of this political transformation. Female prophets, teachers, and community leaders posed obvious problems for a religious system that needed to integrate with Roman patriarchal structures. The solution was elegant in its simplicity. Rather than explicitly forbid women's religious participation, church authorities redefined spiritual authority in ways that automatically excluded them. The doctrine of apostolic succession became the key mechanism for this exclusion. According to this teaching, legitimate spiritual authority could only be transmitted through an unbroken chain of male ordination stretching back to the original apostles. Since women couldn't be ordained, they couldn't possess authentic religious authority regardless of their wisdom, spiritual experience, or community recognition. This doctrinal innovation solved multiple problems simultaneously. It eliminated women's leadership without explicitly attacking women. It created clear hierarchical structures compatible with Roman administration. It provided theological justification for suppressing alternative Christian traditions that didn't recognize apostolic succession. Most importantly, it gave church authorities the power to determine which texts, teachings, and practices were authentically Christian. The Gospel of Philip and the Gospel of Mary became dangerous precisely because they presented alternative models of spiritual authority that didn't depend on apostolic succession. Mary Magdalene's authority in these texts didn't come from being ordained by male bishops. It came from her intimate relationship with Jesus and her direct reception of divine revelation. This model of authority was fundamentally incompatible with the institutional system that 4th century church leaders were constructing. The systematic character assassination of Mary Magdalene served multiple strategic purposes. By transforming her from teacher to penitent prostitute, church authorities eliminated a powerful example of female spiritual leadership. They created a cautionary tale about the dangers of women claiming religious authority. They established a narrative framework in which women's significance in Christianity came through being saved by male religious figures, rather than through their own spiritual achievements. The effectiveness of this transformation can't be overstated. For over 14 centuries, the image of Mary Magdalene as a reformed prostitute dominated Christian consciousness. Medieval art depicted her with the symbols of penitence. Theological treatises discussed her as an example of divine mercy extended to sexual sinners. Popular devotion focused on her gratitude for male forgiveness rather than her own spiritual insights or teachings. This manufactured image served the institutional church's interests perfectly. It provided a model of female religiosity that was completely unthreatening to male authority. It reinforced the notion that women's spiritual value came through relationships with men rather than through their own connection to the divine. It eliminated any memory of alternative forms of Christianity, where women held positions of authority equal to or greater than their male counterparts. The burial of the Nag Hammadi texts represents the final desperate act of communities that understood what was happening to their traditions. Sometime in the late 4th century, probably around 367 CE, when Bishop Athanasius issued his famous letter condemning non-canonical books, someone carefully sealed 52 precious texts in pottery jars and buried them in the Egyptian desert. Think about what this moment represents. These weren't just books being hidden, these were entire worldviews, complete theological systems, alternative understandings of Jesus' message and mission being buried alive. The people who sealed those jars knew they were preserving the last remnants of forms of Christianity that were about to disappear from the world entirely. They couldn't have imagined that their desperate preservation effort would remain hidden for over 15 centuries. They probably expected that within a generation or two conditions would change and their texts could be safely retrieved. Instead, the institutional church's victory was so complete that even the memory of these alternative traditions was erased from Christian consciousness. The rediscovery of these texts in 1945 represents more than an archaeological breakthrough. It's the return of suppressed voices that can now speak directly to contemporary audiences without the filter of hostile interpretation. For the first time since the 4th century, we can read what these communities actually believed about Jesus and Mary Magdalene rather than relying on the distorted accounts provided by their enemies. What emerges from this direct encounter with ancient sources is a picture of early Christianity that's far more complex and diverse than most people realize. The relationship between Jesus and Mary Magdalene that these texts describe isn't just about romance or sexuality, though those elements are clearly present. It's about partnership in spiritual mission, shared authority in teaching and revelation, and a model of religious leadership that transcends gender boundaries. The Gospel of Philip presents Jesus and Mary's relationship as the earthly manifestation of a cosmic principle. Their partnership represents the reunification of divine masculine and feminine principles that had been separated in the material world. This isn't just human romance elevated to spiritual significance. It's cosmic theology expressed through intimate human relationship. This theological framework has profound implications for understanding Jesus' mission and message. Instead of being primarily about individual salvation from sin, Jesus' teaching becomes about the restoration of divine wholeness through the integration of masculine and feminine principles. This integration happens not through abstract theological speculation, but through the kind of intimate partnership that Jesus and Mary exemplified. The Gospel of Mary develops these themes by showing how this partnership continued even after Jesus' physical death. Mary's visions and teachings represent the continuation of Jesus' revelatory work through their spiritual connection. This isn't just a woman remembering what a man taught her. This is ongoing divine revelation flowing through the partnership they had established. The implications of this model extend far beyond ancient history. If Jesus and Mary's relationship represents the ideal integration of divine masculine and feminine principles, then the suppression of Mary's role represents the fragmentation of divine wholeness within Christianity itself. The elimination of the feminine principle from Christian theology and practice created an imbalance that affected not just women's roles, but the entire spiritual ecosystem of the faith. Contemporary scholars studying these texts have begun to trace the effects of this theological imbalance throughout Christian history. The demonization of sexuality, the suspicion of women's spiritual experiences, the emphasis on transcending rather than integrating physical existence, the hierarchical rather than relational models of divine authority. All of these characteristic features of traditional Christianity can be understood as symptoms of the lost feminine principle. The recovery of these suppressed texts opens the possibility of reclaiming that lost balance. This isn't about rejecting traditional Christianity, but about recovering aspects of the tradition that were eliminated for political rather than theological reasons. The Jesus who emerges from these alternative gospels isn't less divine or less significant. He's more complete, more integrated, more human in his divinity, and more divine in his humanity. The relationship with Mary Magdalene that these texts describe represents something that institutional Christianity has struggled to accommodate. The possibility that the deepest spiritual truths emerge not from individual enlightenment or institutional authority, but from the mysterious dynamics of intimate partnership. This is revelation through relationship, authority through love, teaching through shared experience rather than hierarchical transmission. This model challenges fundamental assumptions about how spiritual authority works and where divine revelation comes from. It suggests that the most profound spiritual insights might emerge from the spaces between people rather than within individuals. It implies that the divine feminine isn't just an abstract principle to be acknowledged, but a living presence that requires embodiment and expression through real relationships and communities. The question facing contemporary Christianity is whether these insights can be integrated into existing traditions, or whether they represent such a fundamental challenge to institutional structures that integration is impossible. The history we've examined suggests that previous attempts at integration failed because the institutional church prioritized maintaining power over preserving truth. But the context today is different. The texts are available to anyone with internet access. The scholarly tools for interpreting them are widely distributed. The institutional barriers that once controlled access to religious knowledge have largely dissolved. For the first time since the 4th century, these alternative voices can speak directly to people who are seeking deeper understanding of Jesus' message and mission. The implications extend far beyond academic biblical studies into the lived reality of contemporary spiritual seeking. People who have felt excluded from traditional Christianity because of gender, sexuality, or theological questioning now have access to ancient Christian traditions that embraced rather than suppressed diversity. The rigid boundaries between sacred and secular, spiritual and physical, masculine and feminine that characterize much traditional theology appear more cultural than essential when viewed through the lens of these recovered texts. Through the lens of these recovered texts, the resistance to these discoveries from traditional religious authorities has been swift and predictable. When scholars first began translating and publishing the Nag Hammadi texts in the 1970s, Vatican officials immediately launched a campaign to discredit their significance. They argued that these were late fabrications, Gnostic corruptions of authentic Christianity, or simply irrelevant curiosities that had no bearing on Orthodox faith. But this defensive reaction reveals more than it conceals. If these texts were truly insignificant, why would church authorities feel threatened by their publication? If they contained obvious errors or contradictions, why not engage with them scholarly rather than dismissing them wholesale? The intensity of the opposition suggests that these ancient manuscripts touch something vital, something that challenges not just historical details but fundamental power structures within institutional Christianity. The pattern of suppression continues today in more subtle forms. Most seminary curricula ignore these texts entirely or mention them only as examples of early Christian heresy. Popular Christian education rarely acknowledges their existence. When they are discussed, It's typically to explain why they shouldn't be taken seriously rather than to explore what they might contribute to understanding Jesus and his earliest followers. This ongoing marginalization becomes even more problematic when you understand what these texts reveal about the diversity of early Christian experience. The communities that produced the Gospel of Philip and the Gospel of Mary weren't isolated sects operating on the fringes of Christianity. Archaeological evidence suggests they were major centers of Christian learning and practice that influenced theological development throughout the Mediterranean world. The monastery where the Nag Hammadi texts were buried, for instance, shows evidence of sustained literary activity over several centuries. This wasn't a community of illiterate fanatics preserving bizarre speculations. These were educated, sophisticated Christians who maintained extensive libraries and engaged in serious theological reflection. Their decision to bury these particular texts suggests they recognized their extraordinary value and wanted to preserve them for future generations who might be more receptive to their message. The scholarly consensus has gradually shifted as more researchers have gained access to these materials. Initially dismissed as late Gnostic fantasies, several of the texts are now recognized as potentially preserving traditions that are as old as or older than the canonical Gospels. The Gospel of Thomas, found in the same collection, contains sayings attributed to Jesus that many scholars believe represent authentic early traditions independent of the New Testament sources. This archaeological validation has forced a fundamental reconsideration of how we understand Christian origins. The neat timeline that presented Orthodox Christianity as the original and authentic form of the faith, with heresies emerging later as corruption, simply doesn't match the evidence. Instead, what emerges is a picture of early Christianity as a diverse, experimental movement with multiple centers of authority and competing interpretations of Jesus' significance. The role of women in these early communities becomes particularly significant when viewed through this lens. The canonical Gospels, even in their edited form, preserve traces of women's leadership that suggest much more extensive involvement than later church tradition acknowledged. Mary Magdalene appears as the first witness to the resurrection in all four Gospels. Women provide financial support for Jesus' ministry. Female disciples travel with the group and participate in its mission. But these canonical hints pale in comparison to what the alternative Gospels reveal about women's roles in early Christian communities. The Gospel of Mary presents detailed theological discussions led by a woman. The Gospel of Philip describes spiritual practices that required both male and female participation. Other texts found at Nag Hammadi reference female apostles, prophets, and teachers whose names and contributions were systematically erased from official church records. This erasure wasn't accidental or incidental, it was systematic and strategic. As Christianity evolved from a diverse movement into a unified institution, the elimination of women's leadership became essential for compatibility with Roman social structures. The empire couldn't integrate a religious system that challenged fundamental assumptions about gender roles and social hierarchy. The transformation of Mary Magdalene from teacher to penitent prostitute serves as the perfect case study in how this erasure operated. The process required multiple steps executed over several centuries. First, her role as a teacher and leader had to be minimized in canonical accounts. Then her identity had to be conflated with other biblical figures, particularly the unnamed sinful woman who anoints Jesus in Luke's Gospel. Finally, her story had to be rewritten to emphasize repentance and male redemption rather than female authority and wisdom. Each step in this process can be documented through surviving texts and historical records. The conflation of Mary Magdalene with the sinful woman, for instance, wasn't based on any scriptural evidence. It was a deliberate interpretive choice made by church authorities who needed to explain why a woman held such prominence in the resurrection accounts. By making her a reformed prostitute, they could acknowledge her importance while ensuring it posed no threat to male authority structures. The success of this reinterpretation was so complete that most Christians today are shocked to learn that the Bible never identifies Mary Magdalene as a prostitute. The association is so deeply embedded in popular consciousness that people assume it must be biblical, when in fact it represents centuries of deliberate historical revision designed to serve institutional rather than scriptural purposes. Contemporary feminist theology has begun to explore what Christianity might look like if these suppressed traditions were recovered and integrated. The results suggest possibilities for spiritual practice and theological understanding that transcend the limitations of both traditional orthodoxy and secular feminism. Instead of simply advocating for women's inclusion in existing structures, these ancient texts point toward fundamentally different models of religious authority and spiritual development. The Jesus who emerges from the Gospel of Philip isn't threatened by women's spiritual authority or uncomfortable with intimate partnership. He doesn't maintain rigid boundaries between sacred and sexual, spiritual and physical. The divine masculine that he represents achieves its fullness through integration with rather than domination over the feminine principle that Mary Magdalene embodies. This integrated spirituality has profound implications for contemporary religious practice. It suggests that the deepest spiritual truths might be discovered not through individual meditation or institutional instruction, but through the mysterious dynamics of committed partnership. The revelation that emerges between Jesus and Mary in these texts isn't just personal inspiration. It's cosmic insight that transforms their understanding of divine reality and human possibility. The theological implications extend beyond gender relations into fundamental questions about the nature of spiritual authority itself. If divine revelation can emerge through intimate partnership rather than only through hierarchical transmission, then the entire structure of institutional religious authority becomes questionable. Why would you need priests and bishops to mediate divine truth if that truth is accessible through the kinds of relationships that ordinary people can cultivate? This question explains why these texts were considered so dangerous that they had to be buried rather than simply ignored. They didn't just present alternative stories about Jesus and Mary. They presented alternative models of how divine revelation operates and where spiritual authority originates. These models were incompatible with the institutional structures that 4th century church leaders were building, and they remain challenging to religious establishments today. The recovery of these texts coincides with broader cultural shifts that make their message more comprehensible than it has been for centuries. Contemporary psychology recognizes the importance of integrating masculine and feminine principles within individual development. Environmental movements emphasize the interconnectedness of all life rather than hierarchical domination. Spiritual seeking increasingly focuses on direct experience rather than institutional mediation. These cultural developments create a context in which the ancient texts can be heard with fresh ears. The partnership between Jesus and Mary that they describe doesn't sound primitive or heretical to contemporary audiences. It sounds like a preview of psychological and spiritual integration that humanity is still learning to achieve. The implications for understanding Jesus himself are particularly significant. Instead of the isolated celibate figure of traditional theology, these texts present someone who achieved spiritual realization through rather than despite intimate human relationship. His divinity doesn't separate him from ordinary human experience, but transforms it from within through the power of authentic partnership. This model has revolutionary implications for how contemporary people might approach their own spiritual development. Instead of viewing relationships as distractions from spiritual practice, the Gospel of Philip suggests they might be the primary venue for spiritual realization. Instead of seeking transcendence through renunciation of physical existence, these texts point toward transformation through full engagement with embodied life. The resistance to these insights from traditional religious authorities becomes more understandable when viewed through this lens. If spiritual realization is accessible through intimate partnership, if divine revelation emerges through committed relationship, if the deepest truths are discovered in the spaces between people rather than within isolated individuals, then much of traditional religious infrastructure becomes unnecessary. This isn't just about women's ordination or inclusive language in liturgy. This is about fundamentally different understandings of how the divine operates in human experience, and where people should look for authentic spiritual guidance. The texts suggest that the most profound religious insights might emerge from bedrooms and kitchens rather than from seminaries and sanctuaries. The scholarly investigation of these texts continues to yield new insights as translation techniques improve and archaeological methods advance. Digital imaging technology can now reveal portions of manuscripts that were previously unreadable due to damage or fading. Computer analysis can identify textual relationships and transmission patterns that weren't apparent to earlier researchers. Recent discoveries have expanded our understanding of how widespread these alternative Christian traditions actually were. Excavations in Egypt, Syria, and other regions have revealed evidence of communities that preserved and transmitted these texts for much longer than previously thought. Some groups appear to have maintained their traditions well into the medieval period, influencing Islamic mysticism, Jewish Kabbalah, and early European esoteric movements in ways that scholars are only beginning to understand. The implications of this research extend far beyond academic biblical studies into questions about religious authority, historical memory, and cultural identity that affect contemporary spiritual seeking. If the suppression of these texts represents one of history's most successful campaigns of intellectual censorship, what other knowledge might have been lost through similar processes? How many other alternative traditions were eliminated before they could leave traces in the historical record? These questions become particularly urgent when we recognize that the suppression mechanisms that operated in the 4th century haven't disappeared. They've evolved into more sophisticated forms that continue to shape which voices are heard and which perspectives are marginalized in contemporary religious discourse. The recovery of the Mary Magdalene traditions opens windows into this ongoing process and suggests possibilities for resistance and recovery that weren't available to earlier generations. The digital age has created unprecedented opportunities for accessing suppressed knowledge and connecting with alternative traditions that institutional authorities can no longer control. The texts that were buried in the Egyptian desert are now available to anyone with internet access. Scholarly tools for interpreting them are widely distributed. Translation software makes ancient languages accessible to non-specialists in ways that would have been unimaginable even a generation ago. This technological democratization of religious knowledge creates new possibilities for spiritual exploration that transcend traditional institutional boundaries. People who feel excluded from conventional Christianity can discover ancient Christian traditions that embraced rather than suppressed diversity. Seekers who are uncomfortable with hierarchical religious structures can explore models of spiritual authority based on wisdom and relationship rather than ordination and appointment. The implications ripple through contemporary religious life in unexpected ways. Interfaith couples can find in these texts examples of spiritual partnership that honor both unity and difference. Women seeking religious leadership can discover ancient precedents for female authority that predate centuries of institutional suppression. Men uncomfortable with dominating models of masculinity can encounter examples of divine masculine energy that achieves its fullness through integration with rather than control over feminine wisdom. Perhaps most significantly, these recovered texts offer resources for reimagining the relationship between spirituality and sexuality that traditional Christianity has found so problematic. Instead of viewing physical intimacy as a distraction from spiritual development, the Gospel of Philip presents it as a potential pathway to divine realization. Instead of requiring celibacy for religious leadership, these texts suggest that the deepest spiritual insights might emerge through committed partnership. This integration of sacred and sexual represents one of the most radical challenges that these ancient texts pose to contemporary religious consciousness. The dualistic thinking that separates spirit from matter, sacred from secular, divine from human, appears more cultural than essential when viewed through the lens of these recovered traditions. The conversation about Jesus and Mary Magdalene thus opens into much broader questions about how divine revelation operates, where spiritual authority originates, and what forms of religious life are most conducive to authentic spiritual development. The answers suggested by these ancient texts are more relevant today than they have been for over 15 centuries. precisely because contemporary culture is more prepared to receive them than previous generations. The institutional resistance to these insights continues, but it operates in a context where alternative voices can speak directly to interested audiences without requiring permission from religious authorities. The buried Gospels have returned not just as historical curiosities but as living documents with the power to transform contemporary understanding of what it means to follow Jesus and what it might look like to build religious communities based on partnership rather than hierarchy, integration rather than separation, love rather than authority. The question that haunts religious historians is how completely this suppression could have been achieved without leaving more obvious traces. The answer reveals the sophisticated nature of early church political maneuvering and the careful orchestration required to rewrite history on such a massive scale. This wasn't just about burning books or silencing individual voices. It was about controlling the entire narrative framework through which future generations would understand Christian origins. The mechanisms of erasure operated on multiple levels simultaneously. At the institutional level, church councils established canonical boundaries that automatically excluded texts presenting alternative models of authority. At the theological level, doctrines were formulated that made certain ideas literally unthinkable within Orthodox Christianity. At the social level, communities that maintained alternative traditions faced systematic persecution that made survival dependent on conformity, perhaps most insidiously. The erasure operated at the psychological level by creating mental frameworks that prevented people from even imagining alternatives to official versions of Christian history. The categories through which believers understood concepts like revelation, authority, and spiritual development were shaped in ways that automatically excluded the possibilities these texts represented. The Gospel of Philip's description of Jesus and Mary's relationship, for instance, couldn't be processed within theological frameworks that defined spiritual achievement through separation from physical existence. The very language needed to discuss intimate partnership as a pathway to divine realization had been systematically eliminated from Christian vocabulary. When the concepts themselves become unthinkable, the texts preserving them appear not just wrong but incomprehensible. This linguistic and conceptual control proved more effective than physical suppression alone could have achieved. Even when alternative texts survived, they couldn't be properly understood because the interpretive frameworks needed to make sense of them had been eliminated. Readers encountering descriptions of Mary Magdalene's spiritual authority would automatically assume they were reading later fabrications, because the possibility of such authority had become inconceivable within Orthodox consciousness. The rediscovery of these texts thus required not just archaeological excavation but conceptual archaeology as well. Scholars had to reconstruct entire ways of thinking about spirituality, authority, and gender that had been buried as thoroughly as the physical manuscripts. This process continues today as researchers work to understand these documents within their original contexts, rather than through the distorting lens of later theological developments. The Gospel of Mary provides particularly clear evidence of how this conceptual suppression operated. The text presents sophisticated theological discussions about the nature of sin, the structure of reality, and the path to spiritual liberation. Mary's teachings are nuanced, philosophically complex, and demonstrate deep understanding of mystical principles. Yet readers conditioned by centuries of orthodox interpretation would struggle to process a woman engaging in such advanced theological reflection. The text's portrayal of conflict between Mary and Peter takes on additional significance when viewed through this lens. Peter's objections aren't just about individual personalities or gender prejudice. They represent the clash between emerging institutional models that would dominate Christianity and alternative approaches that emphasize direct spiritual experience over hierarchical authority. Peter's ultimate victory in church history meant that Mary's model of authority was not just rejected but rendered incomprehensible. The systematic nature of this conceptual elimination becomes apparent when you examine how thoroughly alternative models of spiritual development were erased from Christian consciousness. The idea that divine revelation might emerge through intimate partnership, that spiritual authority might be based on wisdom rather than ordination, that the deepest truths might be discovered through relationship rather than individual meditation. These possibilities didn't just disappear from official doctrine. They disappeared from the realm of imaginable alternatives. The success of this elimination created a form of historical amnesia that persisted for over 15 centuries. Christians living in medieval Europe had no memory of alternative traditions that had once competed with Orthodox Christianity on equal terms. The diversity that characterized the first few centuries of Christian development had been replaced by the illusion of unified tradition stretching back to apostolic times. This manufactured uniformity served multiple purposes beyond simply eliminating inconvenient alternatives. It created the impression that Orthodox Christianity represented the natural and inevitable development of Jesus' original message rather than one possibility among many that had achieved dominance through political rather than theological means. It provided theological justification for suppressing new alternatives by making deviation from established tradition appear inherently illegitimate. Most importantly, it prevented believers from recognizing that the Christianity they knew was itself a historical construction rather than direct divine revelation. The texts buried at Nag Hammadi preserve evidence that things could have developed differently, that alternative interpretations of Jesus' message had once been viable, that the institutional structures believers took for granted were contingent rather than necessary features of Christian faith. The implications of recognizing this contingency extend far beyond academic historical interest into contemporary questions about religious authority and spiritual development. If the Christianity that dominated Western civilization for 2 millennia represented just one possibility among many, what does this mean for people seeking authentic spiritual guidance today? If alternative traditions were suppressed for political rather than theological reasons, might they offer resources for addressing contemporary spiritual needs that Orthodox Christianity has struggled to meet? The Gospel of Philip's approach to integrating sacred and sexual dimensions of human experience speaks directly to contemporary struggles with religious attitudes towards sexuality and intimate partnership. Traditional Christianity's suspicion of physical pleasure and its requirement of celibacy for religious leadership appear more cultural than essential when viewed alongside ancient Christian texts that celebrated rather than feared the spiritual potential of intimate relationship. The model of spiritual authority presented in the Gospel of Mary addresses contemporary concerns about hierarchical religious structures and the exclusion of women from leadership roles. Mary's authority doesn't depend on institutional appointment or apostolic succession. It emerges from her direct spiritual experience and her ability to communicate divine insights to others. This model suggests possibilities for religious leadership based on wisdom and spiritual development, rather than gender and institutional position. Even more fundamentally, these texts challenge the individualistic approach to spiritual development that characterizes much contemporary religious seeking. Both traditional Christianity and secular spirituality typically focus on individual relationship with the divine or personal psychological development. The partnership model presented in these ancient texts suggests that the deepest spiritual insights might emerge through the mysterious dynamics between people rather than within isolated individuals. This relational approach to spiritual development has profound implications for how contemporary seekers might approach their religious lives. Instead of viewing intimate partnerships as distractions from spiritual practice, these texts suggest they might be primary venues for spiritual realization. Instead of seeking transcendence through withdrawal from worldly engagement, they point toward transformation through full participation in embodied existence. The resistance to these insights from traditional religious authorities reveals how threatening this relational model remains to institutional Christianity. If spiritual development happens primarily through intimate partnership rather than through church programs and pastoral guidance, what role do religious institutions serve? If divine revelation emerges between people rather than through hierarchical transmission, why do believers need priests and bishops to mediate their relationship with God? These questions explain why the recovery of these texts represents more than historical curiosity. They challenge fundamental assumptions about how spiritual authority operates and where people should look for authentic religious guidance. The ancient communities that produced and preserved these texts were asking the same questions that contemporary spiritual seekers are asking about institutional religion, gender equality, and the integration of spirituality with ordinary life. The answers they developed, preserved in documents like the Gospel of Philip and the Gospel of Mary, weren't just relevant to their historical moment. They speak directly to contemporary concerns about religious authenticity, spiritual authority, and the possibilities for creating religious communities that honor both individual development and intimate partnership. The timing of their rediscovery in the 20th century coincides with broader cultural shifts that make their message more comprehensible than it has been for centuries. The psychology of integration, the environmental understanding of interconnectedness, the feminist critique of hierarchical structures, the growing emphasis on direct spiritual experience, All of these contemporary developments create a context in which ancient texts about partnership and relational spiritual authority can be heard with fresh understanding. The scholarly investigation of these materials continues to reveal new dimensions of their significance as translation techniques improve and archaeological methods advance. Recent discoveries have expanded our understanding of how widespread these alternative Christian traditions actually were, and how long they persisted despite official suppression. Evidence suggests that some communities maintained these traditions well into the medieval period, influencing mystical movements within Islam, Judaism, and esoteric Christianity in ways that researchers are only beginning to understand. The implications extend beyond religious studies into broader questions about historical memory, cultural transmission, and the mechanisms through which alternative voices are marginalized or recovered. The burial and rediscovery of these texts provides a case study in how suppressed knowledge can survive periods of persecution and emerge when cultural conditions become more receptive to its message. The digital age has created unprecedented opportunities for accessing and studying these materials. Without the institutional gatekeeping that once controlled religious knowledge, complete translations are available online to anyone with internet access. Scholarly tools for interpretation are widely distributed. Digital imaging technology continues to reveal previously unreadable portions of damaged manuscripts. This democratization of access means that the texts can speak directly to contemporary audiences without the filtering that has historically shaped their reception. People can encounter the Gospel of Philip's description of Jesus and Mary's relationship without having to accept ecclesiastical interpretations that minimize its significance. They can read the Gospel of Mary's account of female spiritual authority without the apologetic frameworks that traditional scholarship has used to explain away its implications. The result is a growing recognition that these ancient texts offer resources for addressing contemporary spiritual concerns that Orthodox Christianity has struggled to accommodate. The integration of masculine and feminine principles, the celebration of intimate partnership as a pathway to divine realization, the model of spiritual authority based on wisdom rather than institutional position. All of these themes resonate with contemporary seekers in ways that suggest their message may be more relevant today than when they were first written. The conversation about Jesus and Mary Magdalene thus opens into much broader questions about the nature of spiritual development, the sources of religious authority, and the possibilities for creating authentic spiritual communities in the contemporary world. The answers suggested by these recovered texts challenge both traditional religious orthodoxy and secular approaches to personal development by pointing toward possibilities that transcend the limitations of both. The institutional resistance to these insights continues, but it operates in a transformed context where alternative voices can reach interested audiences directly without requiring permission from religious authorities. The texts that were buried in the Egyptian desert have returned not as museum curiosities but as living documents with the power to reshape contemporary understanding of what it means to follow Jesus and what it might look like to build spiritual communities based on partnership, integration and authentic relationship rather than hierarchy, separation, and institutional control. Control. The question that emerges from all this evidence isn't whether these ancient texts prove definitively that Jesus was married. Archaeological documents require careful interpretation, and absolute historical certainty about events from 2,000 years ago remains elusive. The real question is why the possibility of Jesus having a wife became so threatening to institutional Christianity that it required complete elimination from historical memory. The answer reveals something profound about the transformation of Christianity from a diverse spiritual movement into a unified political institution. When Constantine legalized Christianity in the 4th century, he wasn't just granting religious freedom. He was making a calculated decision that would fundamentally alter both the Roman Empire and Christianity itself. But Constantine faced a complex challenge that most people don't understand. Christianity in the 4th century wasn't a single unified religion. It was a collection of communities with radically different beliefs about Jesus, salvation, divine revelation, and spiritual practice. Some groups believed Jesus was fully divine but not truly human. Others taught he was human but not divine. Some communities baptized the dead and practiced elaborate mystical rituals. Others rejected marriage entirely and lived in strict celibacy. Some were led by women prophets who claimed direct revelation from the risen Christ. Others insisted only male bishops could legitimately interpret divine truth. This diversity wasn't just theological confusion that needed clarification. It represented fundamentally different visions of how human beings should relate to the divine and organize their spiritual communities. The groups that treasured texts like the Gospel of Philip and the Gospel of Mary weren't simply offering alternative interpretations of familiar stories. They were proposing entirely different models of spiritual authority, religious leadership, and the path to divine realization. Constantine needed Christianity to serve as a unifying force for his empire, which meant he needed clear doctrines, standardized practices, and hierarchical authority structures that could integrate with Roman administrative systems. The experimental, mystical, egalitarian forms of Christianity represented in these buried texts were exactly what imperial policy couldn't accommodate. They were too diverse, too democratic, too resistant to centralized control. The Council of Nicaea in 325 CE is remembered for establishing the doctrine of the Trinity. But its more significant achievement was creating mechanisms for defining orthodox belief and eliminating alternatives. The bishops who gathered weren't just debating abstract theological concepts. They were deciding which version of Christianity would receive imperial support and which would face persecution as illegal heresy. The political implications were staggering. Christian communities that aligned with imperial orthodoxy gained access to resources, legal protection, and social influence. Communities that refused to conform faced exile, imprisonment, and death. The theological debates that seem so academic to modern readers were literally matters of life and death for ancient believers. This imperial backing came with conditions that fundamentally altered Christianity's character. The religion that emerged from 4th century councils was designed to be compatible with Roman power structures. It emphasized obedience to authority, acceptance of social hierarchy, and the importance of maintaining political order. The radical egalitarianism that had characterized many early Christian communities was systematically eliminated as incompatible with imperial governance. Women's spiritual leadership became an immediate casualty of this political transformation. Female prophets, teachers, and community leaders posed obvious problems for a religious system that needed to integrate with Roman patriarchal structures. Rather than explicitly forbid women's participation, church authorities developed more subtle mechanisms for excluding them from positions of influence. The doctrine of apostolic succession became the primary tool for this exclusion. According to this teaching, legitimate spiritual authority could only be transmitted through an unbroken chain of male ordination stretching back to the original apostles. Since women couldn't receive ordination, they automatically lacked authentic religious authority regardless of their wisdom, spiritual experience, or community recognition. This doctrinal innovation solved multiple problems simultaneously. It eliminated women's leadership without appearing to attack women directly. It created clear hierarchical structures that Roman administrators could understand and work with. It provided theological justification for suppressing alternative Christian traditions that didn't recognize apostolic succession. Most crucially, it gave church authorities the power to determine which texts, teachings, and practices were authentically Christian. The Gospel of Philip and the Gospel of Mary became dangerous precisely because they presented models of spiritual authority that didn't depend on apostolic succession. Mary Magdalene's authority in these texts didn't come from being appointed by male religious leaders. It emerged from her intimate relationship with Jesus and her direct reception of divine revelation. This model was fundamentally incompatible with the institutional system that 4th-century bishops were constructing. The character assassination of Mary Magdalene served multiple strategic purposes within this larger political project. By transforming her from teacher to penitent prostitute, church authorities eliminated a powerful example of female spiritual leadership. They created a cautionary narrative about the dangers of women claiming religious authority. They established a framework where women's significance in Christianity came through being rescued by male religious figures rather than through their own spiritual achievements. The effectiveness of this transformation cannot be overstated. For 14 centuries, the image of Mary Magdalene as a reformed prostitute dominated Christian consciousness so completely that most believers assumed it was biblical fact. Medieval artists depicted her with symbols of penitence. Theological treatises discussed her as an example of divine mercy extended to sexual sinners. Popular devotion focused on her gratitude for male forgiveness rather than her own spiritual insights. This manufactured image served institutional interests perfectly. It provided a model of female religiosity that posed no threat to male authority. It reinforced the idea that women's spiritual value came through relationships with men rather than through direct connection to the divine. It eliminated any memory of alternative forms of Christianity where women held positions equal to or greater than their male counterparts. But the suppression went deeper than simply rewriting individual stories. church authorities had to eliminate entire ways of thinking about spirituality that made these alternative models comprehensible. The very concepts needed to understand intimate partnership as a pathway to divine realization had to be systematically removed from Christian vocabulary and consciousness. The Gospel of Philip's description of Jesus and Mary's relationship couldn't be processed within theological frameworks that defined spiritual achievement through separation from physical existence. When the conceptual tools needed to understand something are eliminated, the thing itself becomes not just wrong but literally unthinkable. This linguistic and psychological control proved more effective than physical suppression alone could achieve. The burial of the Nag Hammadi texts around 367 CE represents the final desperate act of communities that understood what was happening to their traditions. Bishop Athanasius had just issued his famous letter condemning non-canonical books, and communities throughout Egypt knew their precious texts were about to be confiscated and destroyed. Someone, probably monks from a nearby monastery, carefully wrapped 52 texts in leather covers, sealed them in pottery jars, and buried them in the desert. They were preserving not just books, but entire worldviews, complete theological systems, alternative understandings of Jesus' message and mission. These people knew they were witnessing the end of forms of Christianity that had existed for centuries. They couldn't have imagined their preservation effort would remain hidden for over 15 centuries. They probably expected that within a generation political conditions would change, and their texts could be safely retrieved. Instead, the institutional church's victory was so complete that even the memory of these alternatives was erased from Christian consciousness. What makes the 1945 rediscovery so significant isn't just the archaeological value of ancient manuscripts. It's the return of suppressed voices that can now speak directly to contemporary audiences without institutional filtering. For the first time since the 4th century, people can read what these communities actually believed about Jesus and Mary rather than accepting distorted accounts from their enemies. The picture that emerges challenges fundamental assumptions about Christian origins and development. Early Christianity wasn't the unified tradition that later historians portrayed. It was a diverse, experimental movement where different communities developed radically different approaches to spiritual practice, religious authority, and theological understanding. The relationship between Jesus and Mary Magdalene described in these texts represents more than historical curiosity about ancient personalities. It symbolizes alternative possibilities for understanding divine revelation, spiritual development, and religious community that were eliminated for political rather than theological reasons. The Gospel of Philip presents their partnership as the earthly manifestation of cosmic principles about the integration of divine masculine and feminine energies. This isn't just human romance elevated to spiritual significance. It's a theological framework that understands divine wholeness as emerging through the dynamic interaction between complementary principles, rather than through individual transcendence of material existence. This model has revolutionary implications for contemporary spirituality. Instead of viewing intimate relationships as distractions from spiritual development, It suggests they might be primary venues for encountering divine reality, instead of seeking transcendence through withdrawal from physical existence. It points toward transformation through full engagement with embodied life. The Gospel of Mary develops these themes by showing how spiritual partnership can continue beyond physical death through ongoing revelation and teaching. Mary's visions and insights represent the continuation of Jesus' revelatory work through their established connection. This isn't a woman passively remembering what a man taught her. This is active divine revelation flowing through relationship. The implications extend far beyond gender questions into fundamental issues about the nature of spiritual authority and religious community. If the deepest spiritual truths emerge through intimate partnership rather than individual enlightenment, if divine revelation operates through relationship rather than hierarchical transmission, then traditional models of religious leadership and institutional structure become questionable. Contemporary scholars studying these texts have begun tracing the effects of suppressing the feminine principle throughout Christian history. The demonization of sexuality, the suspicion of women's spiritual experiences, the emphasis on transcending rather than integrating physical existence, the preference for hierarchical rather than relational models of authority. All of these characteristic features of traditional Christianity can be understood as symptoms of this theological imbalance. The recovery of these suppressed texts opens possibilities for reclaiming lost dimensions of Christian spirituality. This isn't about rejecting traditional Christianity, but about recovering aspects that were eliminated for political reasons. The Jesus who emerges from these alternative gospels isn't less significant or less divine. He's more complete, more integrated, more fully human in his divinity, and more authentically divine in his humanity. The question facing contemporary Christianity is whether these insights can be integrated into existing traditions, or whether they represent such fundamental challenges to institutional structures that accommodation is impossible. The history we've examined suggests previous attempts at integration failed because institutions prioritized maintaining power over preserving truth. But contemporary conditions are different. These texts are now available to anyone with internet access. Scholarly tools for interpreting them are widely distributed. The institutional barriers that once controlled religious knowledge have largely dissolved. Digital technology has democratized access to suppressed traditions in ways that make traditional gatekeeping impossible. For the first time since the 4th century, alternative voices can speak directly to spiritual seekers, without requiring permission from religious authorities. People who feel excluded from conventional Christianity because of gender, sexuality, or theological questioning can discover ancient Christian traditions that embraced rather than suppressed diversity. The implications ripple through contemporary religious life in unexpected ways. Women seeking spiritual leadership can find ancient precedents for female authority that predate institutional suppression. Men uncomfortable with dominating models of masculinity can encounter examples of divine masculine energy that achieves fulfillment through partnership rather than control. Perhaps most significantly, these texts offer resources for reimagining the relationship between spirituality and sexuality that traditional Christianity has found so problematic. Instead of viewing physical intimacy as incompatible with spiritual development, they present it as a potential pathway to divine realization. This integration of sacred and sexual represents one of the most radical challenges these ancient texts pose to contemporary religious consciousness. The dualistic thinking that separates spirit from matter, sacred from secular, divine from human, appears more cultural than essential when viewed through the lens of these recovered traditions. The conversation about Jesus and Mary Magdalene thus opens into broader questions about divine revelation, spiritual authority, and authentic religious community. The answers suggested by these ancient texts are more relevant today than they've been for centuries, precisely because contemporary culture is more prepared to receive them. The institutional resistance continues, but it operates in a context where suppressed voices can reach interested audiences directly. The buried Gospels have returned not as historical curiosities but as living documents with power to transform contemporary understanding of what following Jesus might actually involve. The evidence is there, waiting in digital archives and scholarly editions. The choice facing each generation is whether to investigate what was hidden or remain content with inherited assumptions. The communities that buried these texts in the Egyptian desert made their choice centuries ago. They chose preservation over safety, truth over convenience, hope over despair. Now their desperate act of faith has borne fruit in ways they never could have imagined. The voice they tried to preserve can speak again to people ready to hear what institutional authorities spent centuries ensuring would never be spoken. The question that haunts every serious investigator of these texts is what other revelations might still be buried beneath centuries of institutional control. If the systematic erasure of Mary Magdalene's true role could be accomplished so completely, what other fundamental aspects of Jesus' life and teaching have been deliberately obscured or eliminated entirely? Recent archaeological discoveries suggest we've only scratched the surface of what was hidden. In 2012, a Harvard professor announced the discovery of a papyrus fragment that explicitly refers to Jesus' wife. The text, written in Coptic and dating to the 4th century, contains the phrase, "Jesus said to them, 'My wife.'" The fragment is damaged, but the implications are clear. This wasn't an isolated reference. It was part of a larger conversation about Jesus' marital status that early Christian communities were actively discussing. The institutional response was swift and predictable. Vatican officials immediately questioned the fragment's authenticity. Other scholars raised concerns about its provenance and dating. The academic establishment mobilized to minimize its significance, just as they had done with the Nag Hammadi text decades earlier. But the pattern of resistance reveals more than the critics intended. Why would a few words on an ancient papyrus fragment provoke such intense opposition if they were truly insignificant? The answer lies in understanding what's really at stake in these discoveries. This isn't just about whether Jesus was married. It's about the entire foundation upon which institutional Christianity has built its authority for 2 millennia. If Jesus had a wife, If women held positions of spiritual leadership in the earliest Christian communities, if the model of religious authority was based on partnership rather than hierarchy, then the structures that have dominated Western Christianity for centuries lose their divine mandate. The implications become even more staggering when you examine what these texts reveal about the nature of Jesus' teaching itself. The canonical Gospels present Jesus as primarily concerned with individual salvation, moral behavior, and preparation for a future kingdom. But the alternative Gospels discovered at Nag Hammadi portray a teacher whose central message was about the transformation of consciousness in the present moment through direct spiritual experience. The Gospel of Thomas, found in the same collection as the Gospel of Philip, contains sayings attributed to Jesus that sound more like Buddhist or Hindu wisdom teachings than traditional Christian doctrine. Jesus speaks of finding the kingdom of heaven within yourself, of becoming like him through spiritual realization, of discovering that the divine and human are not separate categories but different aspects of the same reality. These aren't just different interpretations of familiar Christian themes. They represent a completely different understanding of what Jesus' mission was about. Instead of establishing a religious institution that would mediate between believers and God, these texts suggest Jesus was teaching people how to access divine reality directly through their own spiritual development. The relationship with Mary Magdalene fits perfectly within this alternative framework. If Jesus' primary teaching was about consciousness transformation through direct experience, then his intimate partnership with Mary would have served as a living demonstration of how this transformation operates. Their relationship wasn't just personal or romantic, it was pedagogical, showing followers how the integration of masculine and feminine principles leads to spiritual realization. This educational dimension of their partnership explains why the Gospel of Philip describes Jesus kissing Mary often. In ancient mystical traditions, the exchange of breath through kissing was understood as a method of transmitting spiritual energy and wisdom. What might appear to modern readers as evidence of romantic relationship was actually a description of advanced spiritual instruction happening through intimate physical contact. The Gospel of Mary develops this theme by showing how Mary continued to receive and transmit Jesus' teachings after his physical death. Her visions and revelations weren't just personal spiritual experiences. They were continuation of the educational process that had begun through their intimate partnership while he was alive. The other disciples' resistance to her teaching represents their failure to understand that spiritual authority could be transmitted through love rather than institutional appointment. This model of spiritual education through intimate partnership has profound implications for understanding how divine revelation operates. Instead of coming through individual mystical experience or institutional transmission, the deepest spiritual insights emerge through the mysterious dynamics between people who have achieved genuine intimacy and mutual understanding. Contemporary neuroscience research provides unexpected support for this ancient understanding. Studies of couples in long-term committed relationships show that their brains begin to synchronize in ways that allow them to access expanded states of consciousness together that neither could achieve alone. The neurological changes associated with deep intimacy create conditions for the kind of shared awareness that these ancient texts describe as the pathway to divine realization. The suppression of this relational model of spiritual development had consequences that extended far beyond eliminating women from religious leadership. It created a form of Christianity that emphasized individual relationship with God rather than communal transformation through intimate partnership. Believers were taught to seek salvation through personal faith rather than through the kind of deep sharing and mutual support that creates genuine spiritual community. This individualistic approach to spirituality served institutional interests perfectly. Isolated believers dependent on church mediation for their relationship with God were much easier to control than communities of practitioners supporting each other's spiritual development through intimate partnership and shared revelation. The elimination of the partnership model wasn't just about gender politics. It was about preventing the formation of autonomous spiritual communities that wouldn't need institutional oversight. The archaeological evidence continues to accumulate in ways that support this interpretation. Excavations at early Christian sites throughout the Mediterranean reveal communities that practiced forms of worship and spiritual development very different from what later became Orthodox Christianity. These communities built circular rather than hierarchical gathering spaces. Their art depicts men and women participating equally in religious ceremonies. Their burial practices suggest they understood death as transformation rather than judgment. Most significantly, these archaeological sites contain evidence of practices that required both male and female participation for their completion. Sacred meals where couples shared specially prepared foods. Ritual baths that involved partners supporting each other through spiritual purification. Meditation spaces designed for pairs rather than individuals. These weren't just religious communities that happened to include women. They were spiritual systems based on the understanding that the deepest truths emerge through partnership. The systematic destruction of these sites and practices represents one of history's most successful campaigns of cultural genocide. Within a few centuries, forms of Christianity based on partnership and shared revelation had been so thoroughly eliminated that even the memory of their existence was erased from historical consciousness. But the suppression created problems that institutional Christianity has never successfully resolved. Without the balancing influence of feminine wisdom and partnership-based spiritual authority, Christian theology developed in directions that emphasized transcendence over integration, hierarchy over relationship, individual salvation over communal transformation. These imbalances created the very problems that contemporary Christianity struggles with today. Alienation from the natural world, suspicion of sexuality and intimate relationship, authoritarian leadership structures, and emphasis on belief over direct spiritual experience. The rediscovery of the partnership model preserved in these ancient texts offers resources for addressing these chronic problems. Instead of viewing them as inevitable features of Christian faith, we can recognize them as symptoms of historical suppression that eliminated essential elements of Jesus' original teaching. The Gospel of Philip's description of Jesus and Mary's relationship provides a template for understanding how spiritual partnership might function in contemporary contexts. Their intimacy wasn't separate from their spiritual practice. It was the foundation for their shared access to divine revelation. Their physical relationship wasn't a distraction from their religious mission. It was the source of the insights that made their teaching so powerful. This integration of sacred and sexual challenges fundamental assumptions about spiritual development that both traditional religion and secular psychology have maintained. Instead of viewing physical pleasure as incompatible with spiritual growth, these texts suggest it might be essential for accessing the deepest levels of divine reality. The implications extend beyond individual relationships into questions about how spiritual communities might be organized if they took seriously the partnership model these texts describe. Instead of hierarchical structures led by celibate male authorities, we might imagine religious communities organized around couples who had achieved the kind of integrated consciousness that Jesus and Mary represented. Such communities would operate very differently from traditional churches. Authority would be based on demonstrated wisdom and spiritual development rather than institutional appointment. Teaching would emerge through shared revelation rather than doctrinal transmission. Spiritual practice would emphasize integration rather than transcendence, relationship rather than individual achievement, transformation rather than salvation. The resistance to these possibilities from traditional religious authorities reveals how threatening the partnership model remains to institutional Christianity. If spiritual development happens primarily through intimate relationship rather than church programs, if divine revelation emerges between people rather than through clerical mediation, if the deepest truths are discovered through partnership rather than individual study, then much of traditional religious infrastructure becomes unnecessary. But the resistance also reveals something else. The hunger among contemporary spiritual seekers for exactly the kind of integrated approach these ancient texts describe. The rapid growth of interest in these materials, the popularity of books and films exploring the Jesus-Mary relationship, the emergence of spiritual communities experimenting with partnership-based practices, all suggest that people are ready for alternatives to traditional models of religious authority and spiritual development. The digital age has created unprecedented opportunities for exploring these alternatives without institutional permission. Online communities can form around shared interest in these texts and their implications. Digital resources make ancient languages and scholarly interpretation tools accessible to non-specialists. Social media allows people to connect across geographical boundaries around shared spiritual interests and practices. This technological democratization of religious knowledge represents something genuinely new in human history. For the first time since the 4th century, suppressed voices can speak directly to interested audiences without requiring approval from religious authorities. The texts that were buried in the Egyptian desert can now reach anyone with internet access, in translations that capture their original meaning without the filtering that has historically shaped their reception. The result is a growing recognition that Christianity, as most people know, It represents just one possibility among many that existed in the early centuries of the faith. The version that survived and dominated Western civilization wasn't necessarily the most authentic or spiritually advanced. It was the version that proved most compatible with imperial power structures and social control. The alternatives preserved in these buried texts offer resources for imagining what Christianity might become if it recovered the elements that were eliminated for political rather than theological reasons. This recovered Christianity wouldn't reject the institutional tradition entirely, but it would restore the balance between masculine and feminine principles, individual and communal development, transcendence, and integration that the partnership model represents. The conversation about Jesus and Mary Magdalene thus opens into much larger questions about the future of spirituality in the contemporary world. The answers suggested by these ancient texts point toward possibilities that transcend the limitations of both traditional religion and secular approaches to personal development. The evidence is there, preserved in manuscripts that survived centuries of suppression to speak to a generation that might finally be ready to hear their message. The choice facing contemporary spiritual seekers is whether to investigate what was hidden or remain satisfied with inherited assumptions about what Christianity was meant to be. The communities that risked everything to preserve these texts in the Egyptian desert made their choice long ago. They chose truth over safety, preservation over conformity, hope over resignation. Their desperate act of faith has finally borne fruit in ways they could never have imagined. The voice they died to preserve can speak again to people ready to discover what institutional authorities spent centuries ensuring would never be heard. The evidence is overwhelming and the implications are staggering. For nearly 2,000 years, the most powerful religious institution in human history has successfully buried the truth about Jesus' most intimate relationship and the woman who may have understood his message better than anyone else. The manuscripts discovered in that Egyptian desert weren't just ancient curiosities gathering dust in scholarly libraries. They were time capsules containing suppressed truths that challenge everything we've been taught about Christianity's origins. Mary Magdalene wasn't the repentant prostitute of church tradition. She was Jesus' spiritual partner, possibly his wife, and certainly one of early Christianity's most influential teachers. Her systematic transformation from leader to penitent represents one of history's most successful character assassinations. Designed to eliminate female spiritual authority and establish male-dominated religious hierarchies that persist to this day. The buried Gospels have returned at precisely the moment when humanity might finally be ready to receive their revolutionary message. In an age of spiritual seeking, gender equality, and questioning of traditional authority, these ancient texts offer resources for understanding Jesus and his teaching that transcend the limitations of institutional Christianity. They point toward forms of spirituality based on partnership rather than hierarchy, integration rather than separation, direct experience rather than mediated doctrine. Whether you're religious or not, whether you accept these texts as historically accurate or view them as spiritually significant myths, one thing is undeniable. The story we've been told about Christianity's origins is incomplete. The voices that were silenced 16 centuries ago can speak again to anyone willing to listen. The choice facing this generation is the same one that confronted those ancient communities who chose to bury their treasured texts rather than let them be destroyed. Will you investigate what was hidden, or will you remain content with inherited assumptions? The truth is there, waiting in digital archives and scholarly translations preserved by the desperate faith of people who believed that someday the world would be ready to hear what they died to protect. That someday has arrived. The question is whether you're ready to discover what they knew was worth preserving.